They told you the Earth spins at 1,000 miles an hour, tilted on an invisible axis, held in place by a force you cannot see, cannot touch, and cannot prove exists outside of mathematical abstraction. They taught you this in classrooms with fluorescent lights and rows of desks designed to make you stop asking questions. And you believed it because the textbooks were heavy and the professors wore authority like a second skin. But I am Professor Victor Blackwell, and I spent 23 years inside those institutions, delivering lectures on Newtonian mechanics and Einsteinian curvature, repeating the mantras of a consensus that I now know is built on something far more fragile than scientific bedrock. I am here to tell you that gravity, as they have sold it to you, is the most elegant deception in human history, a theoretical placeholder for something darker, something intentional, something that keeps not just celestial bodies suspended, but your mind locked in a prison of prescribed reality. You have been trained to laugh at those who question the fundamentals, to dismiss skepticism as ignorance, but I assure you, the ignorance lies in the unthinking acceptance of a force that allegedly anchors oceans upside down on a spinning sphere without a single drop spilling into the void. If what I am suggesting makes you uncomfortable, if your conditioning is already firing synapses of ridicule and rejection, then you are exactly where they want you to be, docile, certain, and blind. But if you are willing to consider that the architects of your education might have been serving a purpose other than truth, if you can entertain the possibility that reality itself has been curated by invisible hands with agendas older than the nations you pledge allegiance to, then subscribe to this channel now, hit that notification bell, and mark this moment as the beginning of your exit from the illusion. There are things I still cannot reveal yet, not until I know you are truly listening, truly awake, and truly ready to understand why the Earth does not fall, not because of some cosmic attraction, but because the very question exposes the lie they have been feeding you since childhood. I did not arrive at this threshold overnight, nor did I seek it. For most of my adult life, I was a faithful servant of the academy, publishing papers on quantum field theory and lecturing to rooms of aspiring physicists who hung on every word I spoke about the curvature of space-time. I wore the tweed jackets, attended the conferences in Geneva and Princeton, accepted the grants from foundations whose names carried the weight of legacy and respectability, and I never questioned the substrate beneath it all. Why would I? The equations worked, the predictions held, and the architecture of modern physics seemed unassailable, a cathedral built by giants whose shoulders we were all proud to stand upon. But cathedrals have basements, and basements have secrets, and my descent began not with a grand epiphany but with a series of small disturbances. Hairline fractures in the facade that I kept dismissing as anomalies, as statistical noise, as the inevitable messiness of any complex system. I remember the first contradiction clearly, a graduate student in my 2009 seminar who asked why we accepted gravitational force as a universal constant when our own laboratory measurements showed variations that should not exist according to the standard model. I silenced him, not with malice but with the comfortable arrogance of institutional certainty, citing experimental error and reminding him that outliers do not dismantle laws. But he was not wrong, and somewhere in the recesses of my mind, a seed was planted that would not stop growing. I began noticing patterns that transcended physics and bled into the architecture of information itself. The same journals that published my research on gravitational anomalies would reject follow-up studies without peer review, citing vague concerns about methodology while accepting papers with glaring statistical flaws that supported the consensus narrative. Colleagues who ventured too far into alternative frameworks found their funding evaporating, their tenure applications stalling in administrative purgatory, their reputations subtly tarnished by whispers of eccentricity or instability. The media, when it covered scientific dissent at all, portrayed skeptics as conspiracy theorists or religious fundamentalists, reducing complex epistemological challenges to cartoonish spectacles designed to trigger public ridicule rather than contemplation. I watched as the narrative was curated in real time, not through overt censorship, that would be too crude, too detectable, but through the gentle, relentless pressure of funding priorities, editorial selection, and the quiet understanding that certain questions, if asked too loudly, would end careers. I was not yet a heretic. I was merely uncomfortable, possessed by a professional curiosity that I told myself was still loyal to the scientific method. But loyalty, I would learn, is a one-way street when you serve institutions that do not reciprocate the devotion they demand. The transition from professor to skeptic did not happen in a single moment of revelation, but in a slow accumulation of evidence that the system I had dedicated my life to was not designed to pursue truth. It was designed to manage perception, to maintain continuity, to ensure that the public remained confident in a reality that served the interests of those who controlled the means of knowledge production. By 2015, I was no longer publishing in mainstream journals, not because I lacked material, but because I could no longer participate in a process that felt increasingly like theater. I began archiving data in private servers, conducting experiments in facilities I rented under corporate aliases, speaking only to a handful of colleagues who shared my unease and my silence. The isolation was not chosen, it was imposed by the logic of my own observations. When you see the scaffolding behind the set design, you cannot unsee it, and you cannot continue performing on the stage as if the backdrop were real. I became an outsider, not through rebellion, but through the relentless pressure of evidence that refused to fit the mold. And it was in that outsider status, in that cold space, beyond the warmth of institutional validation, that I began to see the contours of something vast and deliberate, something that had been hiding in plain sight, using gravity itself as both a physical law and a metaphor for the invisible chains that keep humanity suspended in ignorance. The breaking point came in November of 2017, during what should have been a routine consultation with a private research consortium that had contracted me to analyze anomalous readings from a gravimetric survey conducted in the Antarctic interior. The data was classified, buried under non-disclosure agreements that carried penalties extending beyond professional ruin into legal territories I did not fully understand, and I accepted the assignment because the compensation was substantial, and because, privately, I was hungry for measurements taken outside the curated environments of university laboratories. What I found in those encrypted files was not merely anomalous, it was impossible according to every model I had taught for 2 decades. The readings showed localized gravitational fluctuations that varied not with mass distribution, as Newtonian physics demands, but with temporal markers and electromagnetic frequencies that had no business influencing what we were told is a constant, universal force. The fluctuations were rhythmic, almost patterned, suggesting not the random distribution of geological mass, but something engineered, something modulated. I spent 72 hours without sleep, running the calculations through 3 different proprietary software packages, convinced that the instrumentation was faulty or that the data had been corrupted in transmission. But the instruments were calibrated to standards that exceeded anything available in academic settings, and the correlation between electromagnetic pulses and gravitational variance held across every dataset, every control group, every blind test I could devise. Gravity was not behaving as an inherent property of matter, it was behaving as a responsive field, something that could be influenced, perhaps even generated or suppressed, by interventions that mainstream physics insisted were unrelated to gravitational phenomena. I compiled a preliminary report that was conservative in tone but devastating in implication, suggesting that the gravitational constant might not be constant at all, but rather a variable output of interactions we had not been permitted to study, shielded from public scrutiny by the very institutions that claimed monopoly over cosmological truth. Within 48 hours of submission, I received a visit at my home office that I had not scheduled and could not have anticipated. 2 men arrived in a vehicle with government plates, but no agency identification, wearing suits that fit too well and watches that cost more than my annual salary. They did not threaten me, at least not in any language that could be later quoted or reported. Instead, they spoke with the gentle, paternalistic condescension of caretakers managing a confused child, suggesting that my findings were the result of fatigue, that the data was synthetic and part of a classified simulation study I had not been cleared to know about, and that discussing these matters with colleagues or journal editors would constitute a breach of national security protocols that would result in immediate detention without trial under provisions I had never heard of but later confirmed existed in shadowed corners of defense legislation. They left a folder on my desk containing photographs of my daughter's school, my wife's medical appointments, the specific routes I took during my morning runs, information that served no purpose except to demonstrate the depth of their surveillance and the ease with which my life could be dismantled. I understood then that I had not stumbled upon a scientific error. I had touched a membrane separating controlled knowledge from forbidden knowledge, and the pressure I felt was the automatic response of a system designed to self-seal when penetrated. I burned the original report, wiped my servers with military-grade erasure software, and signed documents admitting that my analysis had been flawed, that I had misinterpreted simulation data as empirical evidence, and that I would submit to psychological evaluation if required to maintain my professional standing. I played the coward that day because I was afraid, not for my career, but for the physical safety of my family, and I retreated into a silence that lasted 3 years. But retreat does not erase what has been seen, and the data I had processed left footprints in my memory that I could not scrub. I began to investigate obliquely, approaching the question of gravity not through direct measurement, but through historical analysis, tracing the genealogy of gravitational theory from Newton through Einstein to the contemporary models that dominated textbooks. What I found was a pattern of suppression that predated my own experience by centuries. Anomalies documented by 19th century researchers that were dismissed as instrumental error. 20th century experiments that produced anti-gravitational effects and were subsequently lost to laboratory fires or researcher suicides. Theoretical frameworks that challenged the geometric interpretation of spacetime and were buried in journals that ceased publication shortly after their release. The archive of forbidden physics was deeper than I had imagined, a sedimentary record of minds who had seen what I saw and had been silenced through mechanisms ranging from academic ridicule to professional destruction to, in some cases, sudden deaths ruled accidental by coroners who had reasons not to look too closely. I established contact with a network of retired researchers, dissident engineers, and former intelligence analysts who had reached similar conclusions and had learned to communicate in codes and dead drops, meeting in locations swept for listening devices to exchange data that we encrypted using algorithms older than the commercial software that we knew carried backdoors for institutional monitoring. We were not paranoid. We were prudent, because we had all experienced the gentle, crushing pressure of a system that did not need to assassinate dissenters when it could so effectively assassinate their credibility, their livelihoods, and their social existence. Through this network, I gained access to documents that should not exist. Classified research from the 1950s conducted under projects whose names have never been declassified, experiments involving vacuum chambers and high-voltage electrostatic fields that produced localized gravitational nullification, observations of celestial mechanics that did not align with the public-facing models of planetary motion. The Earth, according to these suppressed measurements, did not behave as a mass subject to universal attraction. It behaved as a body suspended in a field that could be locally manipulated, its position maintained not by cosmic forces but by interactions occurring at scales and frequencies that remained invisible to conventional instrumentation. The implications were staggering, not merely for physics, but for the entire architecture of human knowledge. If gravity was not a natural law but a managed phenomenon, then the question of why the Earth does not fall into the void was not a matter of celestial mechanics, but of engineering, of a system maintaining position through mechanisms that served purposes we could only speculate about, controlled by entities that had never submitted to democratic oversight or scientific peer review. I realized that I was no longer investigating a physical force. I was investigating a control structure, a technology so fundamental and so ancient that it had been naturalized into the fabric of human perception, accepted as inherent reality rather than recognized as artificial constraint. The isolation I experienced during this period was total. I stopped attending conferences, stopped responding to colleagues who inquired about my silence, stopped publishing even the sanitized research that might have maintained my institutional legitimacy. My marriage deteriorated under the strain of secrets I could not share and fears I could not articulate. My daughter learned to accept my long absences and my haunted demeanor as normal, though I saw the confusion in her eyes when she caught me staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m, calculating vectors and probabilities that had no place in any curriculum. I was becoming what the system had warned me I would become if I persisted: a ghost, a cautionary tale, a man who had seen too much and could no longer pretend to see only what was permitted. But the loss of normalcy was the price of clarity, and as the comfortable illusions fell away, I began to perceive the contours of the cage that had enclosed not just my career but the entire species, a cage built so seamlessly into our cognitive architecture that we mistook its bars for the horizon itself. The isolation became absolute around 2021, by which time I had been formally removed from the university faculty roster, citing extended unpaid leave, a bureaucratic euphemism that allowed them to erase my 20-year tenure without the procedural complications of a disciplinary hearing. My name disappeared from citation indices. My published papers were gradually retracted under allegations of data irregularities that were never specified, and former colleagues who had once sought my mentorship now crossed the street to avoid the contamination of my presence. I was not merely unemployed. I was unpersoned, removed from the collective memory of the discipline I had served, and in this state of professional annihilation, I finally understood the architecture of silence that surrounds forbidden knowledge. It is not maintained by violence, that would be inefficient and visible, but by the gentle, implacable machinery of institutional consensus, the soft violence of exclusion and ridicule that renders the heretic invisible without ever requiring his execution. I retreated to a rural property in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, a location chosen not for its beauty, but for its electromagnetic quietude and its distance from the urban networks of surveillance that I knew were tracking those who strayed too far from sanctioned narratives. It was there, in a converted barn that served as both laboratory and sanctuary, that I conducted the experiments that confirmed my worst suspicions. Using equipment salvaged from classified auctions and components fabricated in machine shops that did not ask about the intended applications, I generated localized field effects that defied the supposed universality of gravitational attraction. I watched objects lose weight without acceleration, observed pendulums that swung in patterns that ignored the Earth's supposed mass, measured time dilation effects that occurred without the relativistic velocities that Einsteinian physics demanded. These were not anomalies, they were reproducible phenomena that occurred when specific electromagnetic frequencies interfered with what I had come to understand as a managed field rather than a natural force. The system was not merely observable. It was manipulable, responsive to human intervention in ways that suggested technology rather than cosmology, engineering rather than physics. I realized then that the question of why the Earth does not fall was not a matter of celestial mechanics, but of maintenance, of a suspension system keeping a platform in place for purposes that served entities who had never disclosed their presence or their intentions to the populations living upon it. The gravity we experience is not the product of mass attracting mass across the void. It is the product of a field generation system so ancient and so fundamental that it has been mistaken for nature itself, a control mechanism that keeps humanity anchored not merely to the planet but to a specific perceptual and cognitive range, preventing the exploration of realities that exist just beyond the frequency bands we are permitted to perceive. I understood why my research had been suppressed, why my colleagues had been silenced, why the entire architecture of modern physics had been constructed to prevent the recognition of this fundamental artifice. To admit that gravity is manufactured would be to admit that reality itself is curated, that the seemingly immutable laws of nature are merely the operating protocols of a prison disguised as a planet, maintained by custodians who view human consciousness as something to be managed rather than liberated. I sit in this barn now, surrounded by equipment that measures the fluctuations of a field I was trained to believe was divine in its permanence, and I feel neither madness nor despair, but a cold, lucid clarity that is almost unbearable in its intensity. The Earth does not fall because falling was never the risk. Containment is the function, and we have been falling all along, falling for the illusion that our cage was the cosmos itself. I offer you no proof that you can submit to a peer-reviewed journal, no equations that will satisfy your residual need for academic validation, no ending that wraps these observations into a comforting resolution. What I have given you is testimony, the account of a man who stood at the threshold between managed reality and the architecture that manages it, who chose to step across knowing that the return ticket would be confiscated and his name would be stricken from the rolls of the respectable. You must decide for yourself whether I am a fool who lost his mind to obsession or a witness who sacrificed his sanity to see clearly for the first time. The institutions will tell you that I am the former. They will produce documents, experts, and psychological profiles to confirm that Victor Blackwell descended into paranoid delusion, that his experiments were flawed, that his grief over professional failure manifested as cosmic conspiracy. This is their function, to absorb anomaly into narrative, to transform threat into pathology, to ensure that every exit from the consensus is marked as a descent into madness rather than an ascent into clarity. I cannot stop them from writing my epitaph in those terms, and I no longer have the platform to contest their characterization. What I can do is point to the questions they refuse to ask, the experiments they refuse to fund, the data they classify and bury under statutes of national security that have nothing to do with nations and everything to do with security. Their security, not yours. Look around you and notice how every fundamental question about your existence is answered with metaphors you cannot verify, with forces you cannot manipulate, with laws that conveniently place permanent limits on what humanity can achieve or understand. Notice how the Earth remains suspended in the void, not falling, not drifting, fixed in a position that serves purposes never disclosed to its inhabitants, maintained by a physics that feels increasingly like protocol rather than nature. I do not know who built the system. I do not know how long it has been operational. I do not know whether the architects are human, alien, or something that transcends such categories entirely. What I know is that the system exists, that it is maintained, that it requires your continued belief in its naturalness to function effectively, and that your suspicion, even unproven, even ridiculed, is a crack in that system, a vibration in the field that they monitor but cannot fully suppress. I am tired now, older than my years, living in the margins where the electromagnetic noise is low enough to think clearly. I have told you what I can tell you without endangering those few who still risk contact with me. And there are deeper strata, darker implications that I will only reveal when I am certain you are ready to receive them without breaking, without retreating into the comfort of official denial. The Earth does not fall because it is held, and you do not question because you are held as well, by forces subtler than gravity but no less confining. Wake up or don't. The choice was always yours, even when they convinced you that no choice existed. I will be here, in the silence between frequencies, waiting for those who hear this message and recognize it not as madness, but as memory, the forgotten knowledge of what you are and what was taken from you when you agreed to call this cage your home.